Hey everybody, it's Paul Grossman, the dark arts wizard of test automation, and I'd like to welcome you back for yet another of our meetups with Zappeltech. I like to appreciate that Zappeltech allows us to do these meetups, and we have got two great speakers with us today that we are going to be having. I do have to give you a little bit of a heads up, kind of poked my eye a little bit. So I'm doing, if you're looking at me like this guy's doing a kind of a Popeye thing, it is, I apologize for that. It is just an inconvenience, but we're going to power through it and have ourselves a great session here. To let you know, we've got two speakers, as I mentioned. Later on, we're going to have Michał Lech, who's going to be talking to us about ritual-driven development, which is a study in Cucumber and Pact and management. I'm really looking forward to that and talking through some of his capabilities that we do over there. But prior to that, we're going to have Aaron Evans on just a few minutes here, and he's going to be talking to us about test automation frameworks, putting together the puzzle. I figured I'd talk a little bit before we get to Aaron here about, one of the things about automation is working in a black box. And this really means a lot to me since I'm kind of half blind today. This is something that we kind of see when we are, creating our test scripts, creating our frameworks, and we can run them locally on our systems. We can see our browser get popped up, and we can see all the interactions. Always cool to see that. But then we get into stuff like CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous development, and our scripts then sometimes go onto a black box. It's basically running in a Linux box. It might be running in the cloud environment somewhere, and we don't really get to see a lot of what's going on. If we're lucky, we do have an environment that will show us exactly what's going on. If we're a little less lucky, and that maybe a live interaction window into the system. Less lucky, we get maybe a recording of a video that we can take a look at afterwards and see, if our test case failed, it might be at step 17, but the actual issue that caused the problem was at step 2. And then we kind of follow our way through to see what's going on. Even one step lower, well, maybe your whole script runs and you just get a screen capture at the very end, and you kind of have to take a guess at what's going on. Hopefully, you've got a really good framework implemented in there, something like Cucumber, and you put in a lot of steps and descriptions that are giving you output as you go along and tells you exactly what's going on as you go. This is what makes our job a little tricky, but if we're really good at it, we'll be able to work our way through and show our return on investment. Try and find the issues before issues get into production, and then start impacting our customers. One of the other things I talk about that I'm not sure if Evan is going to, Aaron, I keep saying Evan, I'm sorry, Evan. Aaron might talk about is the, I find just this week in test automation, I had unintended consequences. and basically my script was running, but it was actually overloading all the connections to a database, and it turned out it was like impacting our manual testers. Like, turn off the automation. I'm like, no, give us more, give us more RAM and all that stuff. So with that out of the way here, we've got Aaron Evans, who has joined me on the screen over there. Aaron, I gotta tell you, it looks like you have got the most awesome room I've ever seen. It looks like a circus tent to me over here. What is that you've got out there? Can you describe that room that you're in?
Yeah, am I live?
You are live. I've got you up on screen. We've got both of you, both of us
All right.
on screen there.
So I am in a yurt.
A yurt.
Which is like a big circus tent. It's a big round tent with a wood frame, as you can see, and a lattice work wall. This is my office. And yeah, it's hot in the summer and it's cold in the winter, but I manage.
Where are you located at, Aaron?
I am in Montana, so I've got a yurt in the woods for my office. Awesome. And Starlink internet.
Awesome. I've heard your name. I believe I've seen you present. You actually are very well known in the industry out there. I believe you have got a lot of experience.
Slightly infamous.
Slightly infamous, working in Selenium, Appium, REST API stuff, and well versed in all things related to automation and quality assurance. And I'm not even making that up. I just happened to ask Pi AI a little bit about you, and how wonderful that AI is. Well, getting kind of accurate on this. Sometimes it just makes up stuff. So
yeah, it was probably making up my story.
Nah, I know you're good. You're good at all this stuff. We're going to have a fantastic session. I'm going to ask you just to do a quick check. Can you share your first slide on the screen? See if it can pop up.
All right. Oh, it says I've got to give it permission, it looks like.
Yep, I've seen that before. While he's doing that, for all of us who are watching on the screen over here, there are, if I remember correctly, two ways that you can ask questions. One is if you're in this Apple Tech live meeting, you can ask questions out here. We'll see them pop up, and we will go and have interactions with, let's see, we'll have interactions with people as they ask questions here. And in addition, if you're watching it, I believe we're also live streaming on YouTube, if I can remember correctly. And you can also ask questions out there as well. So, hey, there's Aaron is back. We're going to do a quick test. Are you able to share on your slides and stuff?
Yeah, let me try that. So I'm going to click on a screen. Okay. It's probably going to say screen one. It's going to be blank at first. And then I need to hit play. And are you seeing the correct window or the presenter view?
Test frameworks, my favorite thing to play with. All right. Well, I tell you that with that, I'm going to turn over to Aaron over here and blow us away. I'm really looking forward to this. Thanks a lot, Aaron.
All right, thank you. So yeah, I've talked a little bit about myself already. Thanks, Paul. I've been testing software for around 20 years, more or less, with a break in the middle where it wasn't a nervous breakdown, but it was a bit of a breakdown where I decided I'd give it all up, and I moved to Fiji to go live on a tropical island and forget about work for a while. But I came back, and it was really my getting into open source, of love of open source tools, and discovering Selenium around 2005 when it was first getting started, that got me back in and passionate for test automation and open source development. So that's kind of my backstory. And in the checkout room beforehand, Paul was asking me what my favorite test automation tool was, or my favorite tool, I guess, in general was. And I didn't have a good answer because I'm kind of tool agnostic, but my answer was, I think having a continuous integration tool is my favorite thing, and we'll talk about that, why I think having a constant feedback loop is important, kind of the critical thing in terms of having a test framework. And when I talk about test frameworks, right, it's a little bit of an overloaded question. In that, what is a test framework and what does it do? Because the word framework itself is kind of overloaded, right? And I don't know if I'm clicking on PowerPoint instead of on the presentation. All right, so what's a framework? It's an overloaded term, right? I looked up the word framework. This is the trick for amateur talk writer is, use the dictionary definition. I'm not going to read that, but here's 2 different dictionary definitions, and then the Wikipedia definition for a framework. We all know what a framework is, right? It's this superstructure that you build around your tools, and you can think about how a test framework is what you use to write tests. And in development, especially in front-end development, you can think in terms of a framework versus a library. And people say, well, AngularJS, for example, is a development framework because the framework executes the code and your code runs within that framework. Whereas React, they say, is a library because your code includes React and your code is actually what's executing. So that's one way to distinguish a framework. And it's a good principle, but the framework is really, or I guess React is a library instead of a framework. This is actually kind of an overloaded question because a lot of different things are frameworks. And when you say framework, what do you mean? And I'd just like to give a shout out to my boss at Massachusetts Medical Society, Stephanie Wojciechowski. We kind of banned the word framework on the project I'm currently working on, because what is a framework? For the purposes of this talk, my definition is a framework is the tools, processes, architecture, and patterns that you use to write, maintain, execute, and analyze your test automation. So this is my working definition for what we're doing in terms of a framework, which is overloaded, as I said. And there are a lot of different kinds of frameworks, right? You might think of a framework, when I say a test framework, you might think of something like JUnit or Mocha or TestNG or one of these many other tools that is, in my definition, to be more specific, is a test runner. It's a way to write a test case using automation and to run it. So JUnit, yeah, it's a framework, or it's a part of your framework, right? It's the part that helps you to author and execute tests, but it's not the whole picture. You might also think, well, maybe Selenium or Cypress or Playwright or Appium or some other automation tool or library that's my test framework or part of my test framework. And that's true, but not all tests are UI automation. So we might also have API tests or unit tests or performance and load tests, security tests that may be part of our test automation framework. I'm kind of wigging out because I can't see a clock here. I'll get my phone. Oh, there we go. I want to make sure I don't talk too long because I tend to talk about too many things. You may consider a tool used for structuring your test code or writing test specifications, specifically a behavior-driven. Let me take a drink. A behavior-driven development tool like Cucumber or SpecFlow for our C#.NET friends, or Spock or JBehave, or a tool that's a little bit different like Robot Framework that allows you to do keyword-driven development. and structure your tests that way, right? That's one way of looking at a test framework, or one piece of the test framework puzzle. I think if we hop back at the beginning, that's kind of my theme, right? I'm gonna, oops, I lost my focus here. Yeah, putting the pieces together, and you can see I've got this cool puzzle of an architecture diagram as my background. All right, let's hop back ahead. So that's kind of the theme I'm going for here, right? Some other frameworks might be, there are some like all-in-one tools. I grew up using a tool called WinRunner, or Silk Test, or Quick Test Pro. You can see which is now called UFT. Some commercial tools, or some tools that have open source versions like Catalan. Test Complete and Tricentis Tosca are other tools that are kind of this all-in-one tool based around a GUI for writing test automation. That could be considered a framework or a piece of that framework puzzle, as well as other tools like reporting, your continuous integration flow. These are extra pieces of your test automation puzzle. But you've got things that have framework in the name, like Allure Framework. It started out as a reporting tool. It's grown to combine other features. Same thing with extent reports. And you might have a service like Report Portal that gives you reporting services. That could be a piece of the puzzle, or it could be considered a framework in itself. Your CI/CD tool or service, things like Jenkins, GitHub Actions, GitLab CI, Circle CI, Azure DevOps, which used to be called, help me out, was it just Microsoft Test Manager? I don't remember. Well, I think Microsoft Test Manager was part of what became Azure DevOps. I'm not a Microsoft guy, so I don't know that much about their tools. Those could be considered from a QA perspective, a framework or a piece of your framework that you're using. Likewise, we have our cloud services that are used to execute your tests, and they may also have nice tools for debugging and reporting. Services like Sauce Labs, Browser Stack, Lambda Test, Applitools, Perfecto, Headspin. There's quite a few more. None of these are meant to be an exhaustive or a favorites list, just a list of a few things that I came up with. So these cloud services may be considered a test framework or a piece of your test framework puzzle. Likewise, we have frameworks, under code structure, things like Serenity Framework, Selenide, Karate, which I think also might have a UI component, and it might have a cloud service. I'm not too familiar with Karate, but there are tools that are designed to help you structure your code. Robot Framework could also fall under this category. That are frameworks in the framework sense, that they're a system of structuring your code, a bunch of helper and utility classes, including things like configuration, setting up Selenium or Cucumber or whatever other dependencies. Those can be considered frameworks, or they could be a part of this framework puzzle. Hopping back to my, if you remember, my all-encompassing weasel around definition, the tools, the processes, the architecture, and patterns that are used to write, maintain, execute, and analyze our test automation. Let's see. And then we have other things like load and performance, security, test management tools, like harking back to my old days, HP, or it was called Mercury, Quality Center, which is called ALM now, TestRail, Zephyr, X-Ray, Humetry, TestLink is an old open source tool that's still kicking around that some people may be using, that are used for structuring tests, whether they're automated or manual, and for tracking requirements. So these are things that you may, right, when you're asked about your test framework, you might say, well, Selenium is my test framework, or my GitHub workflow is my test framework, or I'm using Allure Framework or Selenide Framework, right, or Cucumber, right? these might be my framework. JUnit might be my framework. It's a loaded question. All of these, I think, play a part in developing that framework. Like I said, with that wiggle definition that accomplishes what we do, or that describes what we do to accomplish test automation, right? And these are just some bullets I'll quickly go through. Here's a big list of test runners, automation tools, and libraries. Now, some of these tools, like for instance, Selenium is just a library, whereas Cypress is, getting back to that early definition, a framework in that Cypress runs your test for you. You structure your code for Cypress to run the test. Selenium, you're going to structure your tests however you like, because it's just a library you include. You may use PyTest or NUnit or TestNG to execute your Selenium test. So you might have Selenium plus TestNG versus just Cypress, which one's test, or just WebDriver IO, which executes test, or Playwright, whatever. So there's a fine line I like to distinguish between a automation tool that also executes your test, leaning more towards framework, and an automation library like Selenium or Appium, or even if you're thinking like Android, Espresso, versus XCUI test on Apple's side for iOS. That's kind of in between the framework and library, because XCUI test also has ability to integrate with XC test, which is their unit testing framework. Now, writing a test specification. This is an important part, and many organizations, a tool like Cucumber or SpecFo might be at the core of writing their tests, because one important thing of writing tests is knowing what you're testing, describing the requirements, describing the features and scenarios that you're testing. And these tools, Cucumber, SpecFlow. Robot Framework is not necessarily designed to create a specification, certainly not in the behavior-driven development sense, but it is a way to write automation code in reusable components that that you can then write keyword-driven tests. The goal here with these type of tools is to make tests that describe what's being happening from a user perspective, so you can understand, or so rather, non-technical people can understand without reading through the source code what's happening in the test and tie it to what's actually working. Here's the commercial automation tools, right? We've got Tricentis, Tosca, Test Complete by SmartBear, Ranarix, Catalan Studio, and then the old-fashioned QTP UFT, which is now owned by Micro Focus. And some organizations are paying large amounts of money per seat to run test automation, which may be new or maybe 10 or 20 years old to still run a tool, which was great in its time, but it's not the style of writing tests with open source. And it was actually by using commercial tools like QTP specifically, where I decided this is not what I like about testing, and decided I prefer palm trees and coconuts and snorkeling to writing test automation, and switching to a tool like Selenium and using open source tools, writing in programming languages I like Java or Python, made testing fun again for me. Tools like Serenity, Selenium, Codeception on the PHP. I think there's Codeception JS, which allows you to integrate and write Cucumber style tests with Selenium style automation. And then Karate, which has both GUI and I think really started out as an API automation tool. Again, this is just listing the tools. Nothing specific I need to talk about here. But API testing, right? There are tools or frameworks designed specifically for API testing. How do you fit these in with your GUI tests? Do they live in a different test framework? Do they work together or separate than your UI automation? A tool like Postman is great. It has a nice UI. It has ways to have collections and ways to execute tests automatically. You have tools like Newman. For those who don't know, Postman is a graphical tool for writing API tests, and Newman is a tool for writing continuous or for executing those tests in continuous integration. And for people who are old enough or savvy enough, Newman was the postman who was the nemesis of Seinfeld on his sitcom back in the early 90s. So that's a fun play on words. Tools like Soap UI, which was designed for testing SOAP web services, but actually also has a pretty cool amount of features for testing more modern or simpler services like REST services. And then Rest Assured and a host of HTTP client libraries, Supertest on the JavaScript side, allow you to write API automation. And it's a framework or a library, if you will. You can use Rest Assured either way as a framework or a library for executing tests, test automation. In my own preference, I like to use a unit test runner, something like JUnit, TestNG, PyTest, or XTest on the .NET side, or XUnit, I should say, on the .NET side, and build all of my automation, whether it's API automation or UI automation, or even unit tests or integration tests, whatever level, to write those using the same unit testing tool, and then incorporate my UI automation, my API automation, etc., using libraries like Selenium and Rest Assured. Then we have load and performance testing, right? Two different things. Again, there's semantics to worry about here. Let me check my clock. All right, I'm not going too far over on time. That makes me happy. Right, we have load testing tools like JMeter or Load Runner, another tool from back in the day that gave me a lot of headaches, that are designed to put a load on the system and measure that load. They are a framework unto themselves, and often don't incorporate well with the idea of having a base test runner class or library like JUnit, and running within the same scope as your functional test automation, whether it's UI or lower level. But load testing tools, and BlazeMeter is a service that's originally based on JMeter. I think it has additional capabilities as well, beyond just using JMeter. And a tool like Locust, which is a Python equivalent for writing load testing and stress testing services. Locust works more like your traditional code-driven tests than a tool that might have a user interface and its own execution model like JMeter or Load Runner. And then we've got at the bottom, we've got this little logo of Lighthouse. Now, Google Lighthouse is probably, in terms of web performance testing, one of the most popular tools. And what it's doing is it's testing how your page loads, how the components on your page loads, times like moment to first interactivity, moment to first element or first code sent from the server, from rendering or complete load, right? There's all these stats that Lighthouse gives you. The idea is a performance test is measuring how your app performs regularly, not necessarily under a load, but to measure how long it takes to perform some task, whether it's to load a page or to update the database or some circuit of steps like that. A performance tool helps you keep a baseline and measure that baseline to see that you're not losing performance as you add features. A little bit different in perspective than a load test. Load test tools also give you these performance metrics, but they're also designed to measure it not only under the normal use case, low load, but under high loads, and to stress the system and see what happens when you exceed your load. Can you fail gracefully? Does your system melt down? Do you start getting 404s or 500 errors? Those sorts of things. And then there's other tools that go beyond load and performance that might be part of your framework. I don't think I have them in here. Yeah, non-functional test requirements like accessibility or security, um, or user acceptance. Right, that there are tools for doing those things. Like Axe is a great accessibility testing tool. OWASP is an open source scanning tool looking for security vulnerabilities and potential things like memory leaks or buffer overflows in source code, which can still happen in type safe languages or whatnot, like Java, Python, or whatever. Um, but on to the next topic, reporting tools, right? Your tool, Cucumber or Cypress or your framework like Serenity may have built-in reporting, but there are specific tools that you can plug in for reporting. Report Portal itself is a cloud service that you can upload that makes it easy to upload your test results and analyze them there. But then there are open source / commercial services like Allure reports and Extent reports that you can plug into your system. TestNG has some reporting services, as well as a bunch of tools built on top of that. And a common standard is actually the old JUnit XML report, which can be parsed and prettified and analyzed in all sorts of ways. For instance, the Jenkins continuous integration server by default understands JUnit XML reports and can display your tests pass failure based on that. Test management tools. How do we track our tests so we know what we're testing? How do we associate our tests to our requirements? How do we determine our coverage? Jira is an old tool that started as a bug tracking tool and has grown beyond measure to include many test management plugins. One of the most popular is Zephyr, one that I've used and can't say I love. And then there's other ones like X-Ray and many others that might be operated as a Jira plugin or externally. I believe there's a Zephyr. I don't know the Zephyr version that is separate from Jira. And then there's standalone tools like TestRail, older tools like Tarantula, or you might use some simple project management tool like I can't think back to the day. Pivotal Tracker is one that I used way back, but kids these days don't need to remember or have me talk about tools I used 20 years ago. And then there's the venerable, which I actually think is still one of the best tools. I did not love my time working with the Mercury tool, which was HP and now Micro Focus, the QTP, which UFT QTP, I don't know. But Quality Center, which is also called ALM or ALM Quality Center now, another Mercury tool, which is good for tracking requirements to tests. Its ability to run tests was geared towards working with Quick Test Pro. Back in the day, I wrote an integration, a simple integration to update test results from Selenium tests, for example, from any tool you could use. Actually, it was written as a library that would map your own open source code-based test automation to test cases and requirements in Quality Center, which made my life easier because Quality Center is a great tool for reporting and tracking. They've got some good graphs. But the user interface for updating tests or for executing tests that are not based on their suite of tools was pretty painful. Anyway, that's a bit of divergence that we didn't need to go into. And then we've got cloud platforms that can be considered a test platform or a test framework for executing, whether it's Selenium or Cypress or other automation. I worked at Sauce Labs for several years, and one of the things I would do was help companies to integrate their existing test framework with Sauce Labs, which oftentimes required extensive rewriting or rebuilding. Um, and Paul or someone else may have known me from when I was doing presentations or working with their company at as a solution architect at Sauce Lab. Other great tools that do many of the same functions: Browser Stack, Lambda Test, Applitools, Perfecto, Headspan. There are many tools. They're great. What they really allow you to do is, number one, offload the ability to run your UI automation like Selenium against browsers and mobile devices in their cloud service. So now you don't have to have your framework know how to spin up Selenium servers, associate browsers, and keep different versions of Chrome and Firefox and Edge and Internet Explorer and Safari and whatever else you need. Add mobile devices, clean mobile devices, and maintain versions of Selenium, Chrome Driver, Appium, whatever other libraries you need. And they, in general, have some decent reporting tools, things like screen capture, video playback, Selenium steps. And one of the newer features of these tools are allowing you to upload your test automation and execute it directly on their platforms, which gives a performance benefit. Makes debugging a little easier, but there are trade-offs in everything. All right, CI/CD, continuous delivery. This is my my hobby horse, my I don't know, my bugbear, whatever. This is, I consider, the most important piece of the puzzle in building a test framework or a test automation platform, right? That is that you want your test to execute all the time, or at least whenever it matters, whenever there's a change that you need to test. You want it to be able to execute on a schedule, maybe nightly. A nightly test run is example. You want to execute on a deploy whenever something changes on your test environment, your QA environment, your production environment, etc. And you want to be able to do it as you're developing. So that I'm developing a feature, I want to execute continuous integration, including test automation, as those things are being developed. So a developer can check in code and know within a few minutes whether they broke something. The best reason to do this from a tester's perspective is you can't say, or you don't have to hear a developer say, it worked on my machine, which is something I've heard hundreds of times throughout my career. Or it works for me, or it worked in dev. It works fine in prod, but why can't I test it? Those sorts of things. These tools, again, just to list them off, Jenkins, Travis CI, really pioneered running continuous integration and tests from your repo with your travis.yml file. New tools like GitLab, Circle CI, and GitHub Actions follow the Travis CI example of having a configuration file in your source code repository so that on commit, on pull request, on merging branches, you can trigger test runs, and your source repository becomes your source of truth for your continuous delivery platform as well. Microsoft platform, again, not my expertise, but it's called Azure DevOps. Team City is another one, and then Atlassian Bamboo is another option. There are many other tools in continuous integration. I don't mean to leave some out. These are just ones that I know and wanted to include on the list because they're probably most popular. So we've talked about a lot of different tools, but what's in a test framework? And I've alluded not just what a test framework is, but that it's not just one tool. It's the way that these tools work together. It's the process of developing your automation, and it's the architecture of how you write and maintain your tests. And then lastly, how you execute them. That's why I make CI an important thing. Do you execute your tests locally? Can you execute your tests remotely? Can you execute it cross-platform in parallel? can you execute a subset of your tests? I'm jumping ahead. So what's in a test framework? Sorry for bullet point driven presentations, but I figure while I'm talking, it'll at least give you something to look at, especially if you decided to tune me out and you're listening to music or something else. You can get the gist from the bullet points. So the tools, like all these tools we've talked to, are part of your test framework. The libraries you're using, say Selenium. It could also include a logging library, like Log4j. Don't use Log4j. Use a couple years ago, there was a security vulnerability in Log4j. That's why I just said that. Right. Other libraries that you may use, including things like Rest Assured for API testing, could be part of your test framework. And again, the difference between a tool or a library or a framework may be ambiguous, and you can argue semantics about that. Another thing that is part of your test framework, and since I like to call myself a test architect, I think test architecture, how you structure your test automation, and the practices and patterns for developing that. That's what I consider test architecture. That's part of your framework. That's part of how you write, execute, maintain, and analyze your tests. Your automation code, I'm going to quibble here, is that the automation code that you write that is reusable between tests can be considered part of your test framework. This may include setup and validation steps. This may include things like page objects. Again, I talked about patterns as part of your test architecture. This may include utilities that query a database or whatever. Right? These are things that may be part of a test framework. Jumping ahead, what's not in the framework is your tests. So that's what I'm getting at, is your automation code should be part of your test framework when it is reusable components, not when it's part of your tests. And ideally, it should be less and less part of your tests. We'll talk about that a bit more. The standards you use, and I don't mean like four-space indentation, mostly because you should always use tabs and you should always use Vim. No, I'm just, right, the standards, the practices, the patterns you follow, and that may consist in the form of documentation. It may consist in the form of static analysis, and it may be just general practices that you teach and enforce through code reviews. Could be part of this framework, right? That's the how you write and maintain your tests. That's part of what, for the sake of this talk, I'm calling a test, part of your test framework. The development process, how you write code, how you check in code, how different people collaborate on test automation, how developers interact with test automation. Are they writing unit tests? Are they collaborating with testers on writing integration tests, etc.? Reporting tools, the ability to analyze your tests over time and come up with a strategy to see how effective your tests are, how fast or slow they are, whether you have areas in your testing that are more or less stable, or whether you have areas in your application that are more or less prone to having bugs introduced, or just that are difficult to automate, right? One of the banes of test automation is false positives or false failures, areas where, in short, your test is to blame. Your test is wrong about whether or not the system is working correctly. This could be because of a mistake in the automation. It could be because of a change in your functionality. It could be because the way you're automating something or the way your environment's set up introduces flakiness in your tests. How you can analyze that is an important part of what your test framework can or cannot do. And it's often, hopefully we'll get to talking more about evaluating. We've only got 5 minutes, so I'm going to jump ahead. How you can maintain tests, how you can reuse code, I talked about that already, and the feedback cycle, which I think continuous integration is an important part of that. I'm just rushing through this because I do want to talk about building and evaluating a test framework. Is that I have 20 minutes left? I thought I had like 5 minutes, and then it was Q&A time and then a break. All right, I'll just keep talking, and you tell me when to shut up, okay? All right. So what's not in a test framework? Specifically, the whole idea of having a test framework is the presupposition that there's something different than your tests, whether it's utility code, whether it's structure, whether it's how they're executed, whether it's the libraries and how you pull in those dependencies. Those are the things that are in the test framework. The tests themselves, ideally, have a pretty good separation of concern between the framework and the test, so that your test, without too much effort, can be ported to a new framework. Or, for instance, you might be able to plug and play Selenium versus Playwright. Or you might be able to swap out JUnit for TestNG. Or you might be able to change your continuous integration from Jenkins to Circle CI. Or whatever. Swap out reporting tools. Change how you log results. Change how you structure your API code. Whatever it is. Right? You want to be able to separate those things. Your business requirements or your features and scenarios, if you're thinking from a Cucumber's perspective, these type of things are not part of your test framework. They might be something that your test framework needs to interact with, but they shouldn't be part of your tests. They shouldn't be part of your test framework. They should be separate. How you accomplish that depends on your strategy, your philosophy, and frankly, your test framework, what it does. Test environments. Often organizations talk about their dev environment or their QA environment or their staging or production environment. Being able to spin up those environments, being able to interact with those environments, being able to know the configuration, a base URL or a database password. Those things are not part of the framework. The framework may need to know how to interact with them, though, through things like configuration and secrets, things like a .env or your GitHub secrets or whatever it is where you're getting that information. Test data like dummy data for executing tests. I need to have 1,000 random users in order to test this feature, or I need to create a user in order to test something. Ideally, your test should be atomic and be able to get or retrieve or create the test data they need, but that's not always the case. Being able to generate test data might be part of that reusable code in your test framework, but it's a gray area. The development tools you use, and this is a preference. I don't love integrated tools like Catalan Studio or Quick Test Pro or Tricentis Tosca personally. Some people do this, but I like to write my tests as a developer. And so having my development tools not baked into my test framework or my test platform is a nice thing for me. I want to be able to pick my programming language. I want to be able to pick my IDE. I want to be able to pick all my different development tools. And like I say, this can more or less, depending on your needs and your preferences. But from my philosophy, not in the test framework. The collaboration process. Your framework or your software should not dictate your process. For those who use tools like Jira or Salesforce, these tools tend to dictate to a large extent based on the capabilities of the tool or what's easiest to accomplish using the tool's user interface, dictate business processes instead of the other way around. The processes for writing tests, the processes for validation and deployment, if they are not tied to your tests or your test framework, that allows you to swap out your test framework, to modify your test framework in place. And more importantly, it doesn't dictate how you're going to write your tests, how you're going to validate things. So separating that collaboration process from how you write the tests is important. Again, your development workflow, things like how you check in code, how you trigger a test run, all sorts of these things should not be a part of the framework if your goal is to have choice and flexibility. If your goal is to standardize on a specific process and workflow, maybe it could live in your framework. And I'm quibbling here, and I should be more assertive about my way is the right way, and blah, blah, blah. All right. Likewise, project management, infrastructure, things like spinning up environments or interacting with your databases shouldn't necessarily live in your test framework, although your test framework may need to know how to work within those constraints. All right, so what do you need in a test framework? I'm going to blow through this list and stress a few things. Here's some examples, right? You need to answer this question for yourself, but these are the type of things I think about when I'm building or evaluating a test framework. I want my tests to execute fast, and I want to get feedback right away from them. I want my tests to be reliable, not flaky, and I want those reliable test results to be repeatable. I don't want to rerun my tests 3 times before I'm confident that I got a result because of environment issues or slow rendering or whatever else. Fast execution in favor of repeatable, reliable execution. Well, that actually ends up being slower if you have to execute something 3 times to get a 50% performance improvement in your tests. Got to think about that. I want my tests to be easy to write and maintain. I want to be able to build up automation that's reusable. I want my reporting to be clear. I've been in many situations, and don't laugh, Stephanie, where the tester has to look through the test report to tell the manager what it means. That's a failure of reporting. And if a report is not allowing you to understand what's happening or to make actionable decisions, well, that's something we need to consider as well. And when I talk about reporting and analytics, I usually think of reporting as what happened, and analytics is what can I learn from what happened over time. So looking at multiple test reports. Test case management and requirements coverage, that ties in closely with the reporting and analytics. What percentage of requirements am I covering, or what percentage of features are being tested? Things like that. How can I collaborate with developers, with manual testers, with product owners, with operations, DevOps, SRE, those sorts of things. The ability for testing and test automation to work together instead of work in its own silo is important, both in terms of getting value from the test automation, but also this is a cardinal point of philosophy that I have, is that the purpose of test automation is to automate the work that these other people are doing to make their lives easier. If we're spending more time maintaining or interpreting or tracking down false positives in our test automation, then that's not giving us value. Or if the reporting from our test automation is opaque or too detailed, then that's another issue. All right. 3 minutes, Paul. Thanks for the warning. We've talked about all these different things, and you can probably read them if you're not listening directly. To make decisions on what we need to do, here's just a bunch of things that when we're developing a test automation framework, what does it need to do? Again, I'll give you a minute to look through this. The idea is, well, we need to write our tests. We need to keep them in version control. We need to get reuse out of our code because automation takes time. If we have to write every test scenario or automate every test scenario from scratch, then the cost of it is too high. We need to be able to execute tests, determine what subset of tests need executed, trigger them when, again, manually or through CI. Keep track of those results and analyze those over time. I've kind of covered all this. Generate and retrieve test data, etc. And here's an important thing. We need to be able to debug and fix broken tests. Now, we talked about what we, I have, I think one of these is this is supposed to say, I think, what do you need to know? So this do on this slide should be, is my software working properly? That's something I need to know. Which tests did I execute? Which requirements are covered? Again, this is my reporting, analytics, and coverage. What systems were tested on which environments? What versions of the code were tested along that? How long it takes to execute? What caused the false failures? How long does it take me to figure out what that was? And what did my automation exist? What issues escaped? These are questions I want my test framework to answer. I'm out of time pretty much, but to build a test framework, I wanted to talk about primarily following that feedback cycle that you can get from continuous integration. Don't go spending months building or assembling a test framework from components. Start small. Follow good test automation principles. I think I've got a slide on that coming up. Things like keep it simple, don't repeat yourself, separation of concerns, all those things. And have a continuous feedback loop. Start small, add features, add reporting, add logging as you go. Think of scalability from the start. And just like all tests, keep it green. Keep your test framework stable and refactor as you go. Here's all the test automation principles I just covered. Things that you need to decide when you're building a test framework, and then evaluating a test framework. Here are the questions you might want to ask. What are your goals? Again, these aren't always the same for everyone. What experience do you have? Do you want to use a GUI tool that's a record and playback tool versus code? Depends on the skill set or inclinations of your testers. What do you want to learn and what do you want to improve when you evaluate a test framework? And I really feel like I've missed out on the punch because I wanted to talk about how we build and evaluate a framework, but I talked too much. And just lastly, measuring success. We want to define the criteria, and those are going to be different, or at least slightly different for everyone. You want to rank by importance. It's really important to us that we can fix failures in tests quickly, or that we can modify our tests quickly because we have a rapidly changing UI. I want to know what my failure rates are. Why are my tests failing? How fast they execute? What are the goals? Can we accurately identify issues? Can new team members write new tests and get up to speed quickly? Those sorts of things. Anyway, I love working on test frameworks. I love evaluating or building test frameworks, and I hope you got something useful out of this and ready for Q&A.
This is fantastic. Aaron, one of the things I wanted to say is you actually compartmentalized a lot of this into different areas. There is there's so many different aspects of automation, and you've actually put it together in good groups. I recommend everybody to who was looking at this, that this actually shows good stuff. I like that last metric slide that you had up there. That's one of the things that I tell everyone is that there's going to be managers who think a good metric is how many test cases have you automated, and when are we going to get to 100%? And have you, Aaron, have you been in that situation where they ask you one of those two questions, and how do you deal with that?
I have. I like to approach things and say there are different ways of analyzing it, and maybe it's me being politic, but the way I like to work is I consider this, and so I say, here's my philosophy. If it matches what you need, then great. If not, it doesn't. But my philosophy in terms of that is number of tests is not your best metric. It does tell you how many tests you have, but fewer tests can be better for several reasons. Number one, they can execute quicker. Number two, there's less of a burden of maintenance. And number three, one problem with having a lot of tests is if you have a few failures and you have a lot of tests, then you might say, well, we've got a 99 or a 97% pass rate. It looks pretty good. Well, if 80% of your tests are trivial and never fail, and you have a 97% pass rate, well, you actually have, what is that? Say it's 80 to 97. So that'd be is that a 15% actual important test failure? So that kind of disguises it, and that's another thing to consider.
That's good. I usually tell people that they're always adding more features and functionalities and requirements, so I can never really get much beyond 80% because there's always more being added on that. I try and avoid the 100% thing. I do want to get over to one other question over here. Artem Golbev asked, what about plain English-based frameworks? That's kind of the whole new area where we got low-code, no-code automation tools. Aaron, what's your opinion on that area of automation tools?
So you can think of tools like Cucumber or Fitness before it that were kind of plain English, or you can think of Robot Framework from a non-BDD perspective of writing plain English-based framework. My answer to that is kind of to judo and say, and that was what I was kind of stressing at the beginning, is that might be an aspect of your test framework, and it may drive how your test framework looks, right? We're going to use Cucumber, or we're going to use Mabel or something like that. But my answer is that's an aspect of your framework. It's not really your framework.
Okay.
Important parts of your framework are execution and, coverage and things like that aren't specific to plain English-based tests.
That's good. I actually know Artem actually is very closely related to a tool out there called Test Rigger. We've had him on the show before, talked a little bit about it, and it's basically it kind of puts you guys like you and me a little bit out of business because it's plain English. You could just say click the add to cart button, and it goes and finds that button. It goes and clicks on it. But there's a lot of stuff behind the scenes to make that magic happen.
From my opinion, that's an aspect. No, reducing the amount of code you need to write for clicking a button, great. And then you have a question of what's the trade-off for that. And then to me, automating something is a small part of the automation framework.
Yeah, I agree.
Maybe not a small part, but it's only part of that framework by the definition I'm using here, which may not be your definition, and that's okay.
It's okay. Let's see. We got like 3 minutes. Let me see if there's one other question I could see in our list over here. I know someone was actually asking, what is Postman? I think it was actually kind of answered in the list there, but give another overview of what Postman is and what it does for us.
Sure. If we had 5 minutes, I'd just bring it up and make an API call. But Postman is a graphical tool. It started off as actually a Chrome browser plugin. You enter a URL for your web service, right? Your API, and you can specify parameters like your headers, your query string parameters, your authentication, your authorization, your HTTP method, get, post, put, delete. And Postman is just a tool that allows you to write, structure, and execute those API tests. It's a really great tool. I love it for ad hoc API testing or exploring APIs as I'm writing automation. But my own preference is to then push my automation into a coding based framework that'll run, whether it's Java, JUnit, or Python, PyTest. And there are some rudimentary tools that allow you to export from Postman to that, but there are also ways you can write things in Postman, structure variables, and set up steps, and some limited reporting with Postman itself, and execute your tests there.
That's a great explanation. Last thing, Aaron, if people want to get a hold of you and any information, is there anything you can share with us? Is there any websites you've got or videos or any way that we could know more about what you do?
Well, just harking back to the beginning, there's my email on the first slide. I'm not much on social media anymore. Like I don't have Twitter or whatever. You can probably search for me on LinkedIn. I still keep that going kind of. And I have in the past and hope to in the future post more content to my YouTube channel. oneshore.com is my website, but it's a broken website at this point.
Oh, no. It needs testing.
It needs development, but I never have time.
Right.
I guess, and I have a blog again which has been neglected. Harking back to the days when I quit testing and went to Fiji. It's called FijiAaron.com.
Great.
It started as here's pictures for my family to see, and now it's kind of my testing blog.
Cool. Aaron, I want to thank you very much for joining us here at Apple Tech on these test talks. I hope to have you back sometime in the future. It's been a real blast. I agree with everything that you got on your list of slides out there. This has been really a good educational thing, and I again thank you for joining us today.
All right. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. All right, that was Aaron. As I said, I've seen Aaron speak at conferences and online and stuff. He's always really great information that he's got out there. Next up, I've got Michał Lech, and I'm going to tell you, Michael, this is kind of new to me. I hope I don't sit there and say, "Oh, everybody knows you," and I'm the only guy who doesn't. So Michael has joined us on the screen over here. Michael, where are you located out there?
So this is really complicated. Can you hear me okay, first of all?
I can hear you fine. You're
awesome.
Good. You're good.
Awesome. It's all with those Bluetooth headsets. They all go very different ways. They need more QA. So right now, what you see in my background is one of the best places in Warsaw, in my hometown. Which is the Royal Baths Gardens, which I had the pleasure of being in last fall. But physically, I'm in Essex.
Physically in Essex. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. Well, we've just left Montana and went across the pond. Sounds cool. I'm gonna tell you if in case anyone's just joining here. First of all, if there's any questions, please. Throw questions in on our discussion. We can see them on the side. We'd be more than happy. We'll set aside about 10, 15 minutes at the end to go through those. And as I said, I've kind of poked myself in the eye. I'm kind of blind doing this, so I'm not quite as up to speed on everything as I should be on this one, but I apologize on that. So, Michael, are you able to share slides on your screen? Let's just do a check on that.
So, if possible, I would share one of my windows because I don't actually have a presentation. Perfect. This will mostly really be a speech, but it will reach out to certain, let's say, celebrities and other people who spoke on the subject that I'm going to be talking about. How Perfect. Do I do that?
In the bottom there should be a little button that says share screen. There's 5 buttons I think you see. The middle one.
Excellent. That. Yes.
And that should be able to bring us up. Mm-hmm. And if not, our moderator should be. Hey, there we go.
Yeah, I can see it.
Work. All right. Well, with no further ado, Michael, introduce yourself to our audience, and I'll let you take it away.
Hello, everyone. I'm mostly a programmer who just ended up specializing in testing and then suddenly found himself a leader of various smaller and bigger groups of other engineers. And my main subject for today is going to be, let's say, a way development can unfold in certain organizations, which is the rituals-driven development. That is a term I used to think I have coined myself. It's like it was my own invention, trying to describe the way certain teams were working. It turned out, nope, absolutely not. This is actually a term which is already in use. So what you see already on the screen is an article by one of the Medium publishers, which is precisely about this kind of behavior. So this is actually already captured. This is already talked about. And my talk today would be around really the basics of it. So firstly, what it is, what makes it, what makes development rituals driven, where does it happen? Is it always bad? Is it just a monster that I'm going to warn everyone against, or does it have a use? Where does it come from? What can cause it? And since myself, I haven't had the possibly dubious pleasure of working in environments where it actually works as intended, the final bit will be the two typical results of it being in place, which is the need to clean up and preferably the need to prevent it, which is one of the things I do as, let's say, the core of my work. So what is rituals-driven development? In short, this is performing development actions because they are prescribed. There is some rules that somewhere someone told us we need to do something. This is now written in stone, or even not. Sometimes it can be following a hype. It can be just being trendy. Like say, everyone is talking about Cucumber. We are now going to use Cucumber without really understanding why, wherefore, what is connected to it. But very often you will see that coming from policies, from certain enforced situations where you need to do something because this is how we do that, which obviously goes right against the very core of the Agile Manifesto. And the main moment where this becomes an issue to be tackled is if you are trying to develop with agility. And one reason I have the Agile Manifesto open is because one of the typical rituals that I will be talking about, well, more than one, many of them, get decried, get disowned, get heavily criticized by people you will see signing this manifesto. So this is actually a phenomenon which leads people very far away from, let's say, our ideal world of developing with agility and quickly responding to changes. So where is it bad? As I said, in any agile-driven environment because of its inquisitive, adaptive, deeply understanding nature. So if you work with agility, you want to be able to react to changes quickly. And when you do that, you want to react correctly, or at least, let's say, sanely, and in a way which will mostly be beneficial for you. The moment you start looking at rules, rituals, at policies, you lose the main reason why certain action is taken. It suddenly becomes replaced with the need to satisfy a rule or to follow a ritual. It does not have to be bad because if you consider a large organization which is actually working to fairly stable set of requirements that doesn't change rapidly, that doesn't have to adapt to a market which is suddenly standing on its head, a ritualistic approach can actually be useful because you might have more junior developers, you might have more junior engineers who don't need to have a particularly deep understanding of every process. Why is it in place? What is it supposed to do? All you need to teach them is just to follow the rules. And that will actually create for you certain teams where work done in the same manner, because it is responding to the same needs just over a longer time, will actually be sped up. Because your agility is not really pure speed. It's more about responding to change quickly and in a very smart manner, while in certain cases you might just want to very quickly churn out a large amount of code, a large amount of features which are already in place. And then those rituals can help you. Interestingly, I've never have come across an organization where it actually worked. So I did actually work for a few larger companies. If you have looked me up on LinkedIn, you will see places like Prudential Financial or New York Stock Exchange or British Telecom. So we are talking about thousands of people, large teams, very, very complex structure of command. And yet none of those places that I have observed practices either going the way of ritual or actually understanding the roots and the point. I've never seen this alternate model. I mostly know it from text, from articles written by some of the signatories of the Agile Manifesto, which deal with why do we need agility, or where did it even come from? What are the challenges that we are trying to attack with that? Now, once we are in this agile mindset, or at least in places which try to be agile, which have heard about agility as this most modern, most cool way of developing, rituals seem to quite inevitably lead to costly problems. One of the things that will happen almost certainly will be code rot. So you will have your practices shaped by certain requirement, but not by understanding and not by constant learning of what is the point of doing the thing. And then, for example, and this is actually just going back to one of my recent postings, someone decides we are now going to use Pact. We are a modern agile team. We are developing multiple services. We feel they should be microservices. Now we are going to capture and test all the contracts. We are now all using Pact. And everyone is using Pact. And 80% of the people who are using Pact do not understand what is it supposed to test. And that was one of my challenges to try and overcome initially, which was, how do I even explain that when you write a Pact test, which sits outside of your code base, outside of your feature code, and simply performs some arbitrary HTTP client calls, which then you believe are the right ones, what's wrong with that? So then you have to actually go all the way back to why is Pact in place, what is it supposed to do, and why it has to be a test. Another a bit grim example, which I have taken liberty to slightly modify, but also copy and paste from one of the code bases I was cleaning up after ritual-based development, is using Cucumber. So Aaron mentioned Cucumber as one of the English, plain English frameworks for test automation. Obviously, Cucumber is a part of BDD, which is a massive subject which goes very well beyond testing. And you would even say that testing is not really the point of BDD, it's just one of the outcomes. But if any one of the listeners has exposure to Cucumber, you will see a massive problem happening here. So we have a developer who was told to use Cucumber, who was told that it describes your code and it should perform the test of the code. while never actually explaining why is it this English-like format, what should this English-like format capture, how should it do it, what does it have to do with product development, what should be product owner's input on it. It's just told, sorry, you have to write Cucumber. This is our new policy, and this is the literal result. So suddenly we have a Cucumber which has a starting point described by the keyword given. Now I'm trying to avoid going on a massive tangent regarding Cucumber and Gherkin and BDD, but rather stick to code rot as a result of ritualism. So essentially, in a complete Cucumber scenario, the steps that you will always see, as long as it's a test of a feature, will be a when and a then. And the code, which is usually hidden, which is always hidden under these sentences, will need to stick to certain rules. So for example, the code which realizes our when should always be code pretending to be our user.
Hey, Michael, I
yes.
didn't want to. I just realized that you're just showing the rituals driven development screen.
Oh, it did not change. It did
I don't
not
think it's changed. I'm sorry. I hear you typing.
Yes.
I see you talking about it, and
yes, that's
see if we can...
interesting because I have tabs open, but not the whole screen. Let's see if I can change my sharing. Oh, show this tab instead. Okay.
There we go.
Yes,
Beautiful.
I found the option. Yes. So thank you for turning my attention, because I was actually looking at the code and I didn't see the miniature of the video. My bad. Again, more testing. So this is already corrected. Yeah. So this is your example of a very minimal scenario in Cucumber, which is actually doing what, well, not really, which is trying to do what Cucumber was made to do. It's still struggling because the point is slightly different. It's connected to product development. But what you will get in ritualistic environments is this version. So we have setup, and we immediately have an outcome. And then the code underneath it, the code that I was working on, was actually not really concerned with those steps being separate and generally describing a scenario. And because generally in tests, we deal with scenarios. We have our actor, our user, or some external system. We have our entry situation, and then a scenario unfolds, and action is taken, and our system responds. And this is very nicely captured by Cucumber. Cucumber is essentially made to describe those scenarios in a manner good for scenarios. So it gives us our scene setup in a given or a step or a set of given steps. But there's always a very, very important thing, which is the user or the actor's action, which then needs to have a reaction from the system. This is really the core, while the given does not have to exist. There does not have to be any particular situation in which we start interacting with our system. So all this knowledge is part of a massive discipline that is behavior-driven development, which has ties to other things like domain-driven design, like arranged act assert as the pattern of testing, and many other things. And the moment you have someone saying, oh, I just want you to use Cucumber because this is the norm, and someone is made to use Cucumber because this is the norm and not because it has a benefit, you will get those very, very weird scenarios, which very quickly also become very hard to debug. Because when people develop those, they will follow like immediate needs. So in the example of the application I have here, we had a web app which would open, which would perform a set of actions. And all of that was wrapped in the underlying code in a manner which actually jumped all the way through. arrange, act, assert, all happening in our first line, in our initial given, including even some assertions about the final state of the app that the user would be judging for correctness. And then our then step would sort of backtrack and try to get like a sub scenario developing from there. So that was actually a very, very interesting case to solve, to even find out what it was supposed to describe. Again, not because of any ill will or someone trying to hide anything, because again, the same code base had a very exhaustive set of unit tests. It was just trying to follow a direction without ever being allowed to understand it. So that's one of the main things that will happen when you do your, let's say, policy-driven, your rules-driven, your rituals-driven development in a place which tries to be agile. There will also be quite a lot of bad stuff happening in your on your management side. For example, if you have a bigger organization trying to do Scrum, you will almost certainly have someone being extremely particular on getting velocities and estimation and getting the points on your stories. And if you struggle with that, you probably will be told, well, you need to get better. You need to get better with estimating. And then we have our Agile Manifesto, and Mr. Ron Jeffries, one of the signatories, is most likely the person who have invented the story points in the early days of Scrum and methodologies based on extreme programming. And well, 9 years ago, that's what he had to say. They turn out to have been a bloody mistake. Because they are numbers. They are so tempting to use primarily, to use religiously, to have them as this great measure for a manager to create a numbers report, to measure your success, well, with numbers. And those of you who have worked in more than one team will very quickly notice, firstly, every team has its own velocity, and velocity can only make sense within a team, if you even track it. Because the team across in the very same office will deal with slightly different issues with a group of slightly different people who tackle problems slightly differently. And what is your 3 points of complexity will be a 5 for them. What is your 1 point will be 2 points for them. But at the end of the day, it might very well turn out that when it comes to usable code that someone at the end of the pipeline can interact with, they are not so different. It's just that the numbers that they have come up with over some sprints, over some cycles of development are completely different, and they actually mean something ever so slightly different. Myself, I very often fall into the trap of translating points into days, which is obviously a trap, but it's sometimes useful. In ritualistic environments, you will most likely have someone who will require you to report your velocity, to make efforts to have that number somewhat stable. And if it just so happens to be lower than the other teams, you will probably be considered underperforming. And in terms of what happens to planning, what happens to story refinement, what happens to all the ceremonies, all the practices, is quite destructive. Because suddenly your way of reasoning, which when you follow the basic agile principles makes sense, suddenly works against you. So that will lead to teams which will try to copy their pointing practices from other teams and then try to follow them. And that, of course, never comes out right, because if you try to use somebody else's numbers, you will always underestimate Like I have yet to see a team which has underestimated itself. Sorry, I might be struggling with my English here, but generally, someone asked to use somebody else's estimations will be very, very conservative and very careful. They will do their absolute best to avoid a situation where, for example, their velocity is dropping or it's not high enough. Yeah, so they will be trying to be very safe in what they do. And again, that was like a live example I had earlier this year, which again can be prevented very easily. Yeah, first thing you do, if you see a problem at the moment of story refinement, where you see a single ticket and there's a massive discrepancy in how people estimate it, this means that there is no team consensus of what is complex and what is not. And generally, you will have your pairs of developers, your testers, your product owner converge on certain common understanding, which means that for the starter, perhaps you need to drop the points. If you absolutely have to have sizing, give it the famous t-shirt sizing, and then get somewhere from there. Another thing I have done in the past was, if there is a lot of enthusiasm for points, without going all the way into the dark side of trying to equate or equalize velocities across teams and try to have people use other people's numbers, if someone just wants you to report a velocity, you drop your sprint close for a time. You go Scrumban. You don't cut off the work of the developers at some point, because that's another stress point. That's another moment for which a developer has to be ready, has to be complete. You can drop it for a time and let them actually just pick up tickets, complete them, continue to the next one, which will then give them certain understanding of which stories they have come up with are complex, which are simple, which of them can be given how many points, and then how much of those have gone through in a week or 2 weeks, which is obviously just getting back to what it really means to have Scrum in place, to have Scrumban in place, to have story points, not a certain direction coming from above that you need to have that many story points in that many days. Because again, that will, just like the choice of technologies will rot your code base, a choice of metrics, which is not exactly working for the team, will rot their practices, their soft side. What I've seen it also do was a degree of isolation. So if a team is told to do user stories, but for example, they never actually work with client-side product people or with client or with customer, those stories do not mean anything to them. So then you have the very foundation being eroded, and then you have very strange business cases. Again, I'm not sure how familiar how many of you would be, but usually a feature file actually has a bit of a sales pitch included in it, which says that, oh, no, we are not debugging this page. As an app user, I want to see a detailed view of my newest message so that I know what my messages look like in the app. And that would be your typical working sales pitch, where someone knew who is the user, what is it that they are paying us for, and what is the benefit that they get for it? What is it they're getting for their money? This is one of those things that get lost in ritual-driven environments, because they are not really about having a close contact between the customer and the developer. There's actually a dedicated team which will do that and will transform it and so on and so on. It will not really do it in an agile way. So that when you try to shoehorn those techniques of behavior-driven development, of extreme programming, of developing with agility into a framework which is not really made for that, those sales pitches will not really mean anything to the developers. So they will usually skip them. They will leave them to the product owner if he's being heckled for writing them. And again, another bit of knowing what is the point of us spending our time in the office creating software is lost. And as this kind of essentially rot continues, that will also undermine the morale. Because again, practical results come from what really is the core of the organization, not this agile facade that is then being undermined by rituals. And for example, you will have your contract tests where the provider tests, those of you again who know contract testing, you know you always have to have your consumer, which will be either a user or another program, and you will have your provider, which will be the bit that responds. You will sometimes have the tests of the provider written on the consumer side, which is to say people who might not even see the code of the thing they are testing are writing what seems to be test for it. And obviously, they will always realize just how pointless that is, how besides any sort of benefit it has to be. Similarly, on the management side, you will see very strange things happening in all the metrics. You will see massive leftovers from one sprint to another. Because since everyone is afraid that their numbers are not right, they will shape their work around having those numbers right. So for example, I will not commit to testing 5 stories this week because I'm not sure they will actually be done correctly. So I will underestimate how much I can do. And then let's say 3 days before the end of the sprint, nobody has work to do. And then we start something new, and then we have a massive leftover. So essentially, both the processes and the code base turn to get derailed by that. And obviously, nobody wants that unless you happen to have a different model. And this is probably the core that perhaps I should make by now.
Hey, Michael, I gotta jump in here again. We're staring at the post from Ron Jeffries. That's all we're seeing on the screen. Yeah, we switched back there.
Oh,
sorry. Like I said, I got poked in the eye here, and I'm missing this. I apologize to everyone.
I will probably need to do something about my color theme because I do get a notification to change the tab, but it's very inconspicuous. Yeah, so when I change what I see, it's not really so obvious. I really apologize. So again, what we now see in the middle of the Cucumber example is the sales pitch I mentioned when talking about rotting business practices, agile ceremonies, where those 3 lines in the middle tend to get pretty much forgotten because nobody really cares why something is done. Why something is done? Because I'm told to. Okay, let me see if I can keep track of the tabs a bit better. So I got to, like, say, this grim story of what will be the things that will happen to your code base, to your tests, especially tests in any newer or less known framework or technology or model. So in my experience, the two most common victims of rotting because of the rituals would be Cucumber and Pact. Literally like 80% of something really, really bad happening in the code base will have a very high chance of being one of those two, because they are not really very well known, to be honest, while they are very popular. Like you will hear almost any modern manager talking about Cucumber and talking about BDD. You will not really meet half as many either test engineers or developers who really deeply understand BDD as a model, or even just Cucumber as a tool. Because again, just as BDD is a massive discipline, Cucumber, which is just a bit of it, is also extremely powerful and very complex thing, which can do a lot, and where you can also get lost. Now, usually, ritual-driven development is not something done deliberately. You will not have like a higher manager saying, "I want this large team to work to rituals." Typically, there will be an attempt to work with agility, which then will get undermined by certain ugly practicalities getting in the way. And one obvious one is high churn. If you have high churn, you will have the case of Pact that I had not too long ago, which was a couple of people who were quite good with Pact got hired. They showed it to the managers. They showed them what sort of confidence can be derived from using it. And that immediately became a policy that was put on the project documents. And then those people left without passing on the knowledge on what really is the point of Pact, how does it need to be tied into the rest of the test code to be useful, and so on and so on. Another thing is obviously following hypes and busts. So certain technologies are very quickly, very hungrily adopted by the best meaning people who just want to stay on top of the times to not get left. And obviously the very, very classic story is the story of Cucumber, which had quite a few years of build-up. Then suddenly, once BDD essentially became a success story in a few places, it became extremely loud and extremely popular. So it started being introduced in many places which were not remotely ready for it. And then it started being a problem. It started being problematic. There was I thought that maybe Cucumber is not so good because we don't really know how to write it. The scripts that we are getting are not really good. Well, if you develop with rituals, your scripts will not be good anyway. And several years later, between this hype and this great appetite for using it and for also commercializing it, we got to another side, which is Cucumber dying? Because that's a very serious question. And in February this year, the last of the persons who actually took part in creating Cucumber left the company, which maintains it as a commercial project, which I believe used to be HipTest, and now it's trying to be Cucumber Studio. So now I expect a massive turn away from Cucumber and attempts to do something else, which is probably going to be a very, very interesting thing to observe and see what was happening. Because honestly, there aren't so many realistic alternatives to Cucumber as a solution, especially where it's used for the real purpose. However, when that happens, when you have those quick movements, especially across multiple companies, to a technology, to a solution, and then back from it, you will again have a lot of legacy code which is still tied to this already dead trend. And the only thing that keeps it going in this place is the rules, even though, for example, nobody really wants to do it. And probably this would be one of those like really massive red flags when you want to avoid this code rot, this process rot. if there is a technology that nobody wants to use in the team, then just don't use it. The other obvious source of ritualism is what I have already mentioned, policy enforcement of tech choices, of practices, like Pact tests are now required. Or this mid-manager now wants this metric, so now you will do it his way. Another thing is, and this ties back to hypes and busts. When hypes and busts tie into policies, you will usually have people forgetting that introducing a new way of working has a cost, because people are already working. There is already a machine which is spinning, and suddenly we are introducing Cucumber. Like, God forbid, we are introducing it alone without the whole BDD model around it. So that will be extremely costly because there will be a whole new tool which has its own preferences on what the code should look like, where should it sit, how it should be structured, what sort of a level of integration should be used for the main body of this, and so on. And all of that suddenly changes. And obviously, the only people who will see, or the people who will see the most of that, will be your people on the ground. Your test engineers, if you have your model of spearheading new stuff by the test engineers, or the whole team, including developers. And sooner or later, it will be everyone, because you will not really have maybe a different formulation. I have never seen like a properly wrong, like a purely wrong way of using Cucumber when, for example, the scenarios would only belong in the tech team, like never touching product development. There was always at least the understanding that BDD sits between the two and spans the two, and you need to engage everyone. So the cost would be initially test developers, then most likely your product owner, and then depending on the team dynamics, it might get forgotten or not. It might just instate itself as this another ritual that just goes on without much reason behind it. And then we get to like more, let's say, efficiency harming syndromes or symptoms and their causes. Essentially, if you have a large organization, you will sometimes have favoritism or some politics. And the case which I mentioned at the very beginning, which was a consumer team writing contract tests for the provider, which is obviously completely pointless and completely wrong, basically stemmed from the fact that one team was checked, was controlled, was verified for having proper contract coverage, and the other was not. The other team was not really asked to deliver certain tests, so said, no, we are not going to write them. So suddenly, the ritual not only does not have a point, it also just gets executed by a selected group of people whose task it becomes to make sure that certain rules are adhered to, which obviously, again, undermines morale. But let's just say I'm happy that I didn't have to rebuild a team which went through that. There were different problems I fixed, but not like this far end. Like if you have years of this ritualistic development going on, picking the pieces of that up. I'll get back to that soon. Another thing, of course, is when you have a larger organization or you have, let's say, a less experienced management, they might not realize how different two teams can be just across one office, which again will lead to one of the ritualistic behaviors and one of the problems resulting from it on the process side. And of course, if you have this appetite to develop with agility, but you always have the deadline. You always have that ultra urgent deadline, which will override the spikes, the proper time spent on results of team retros and such. That will also immediately derail this agility as a process that actually lives and replace it with pure ritualism. On one hand, we do call it agile ceremonies, but once we get into ceremony, we get very fact-like. So when we do our retros, we do try to stick real to what really happened in the sprint. What do we think we can do about it? Do we need to? And so on. Once, for example, we have this permanent urgency, whatever we agree is now a tech debt will forever remain tech debt, will never be repaid. And that, again, will rot your code, that will also rot your processes, and that will erode your morale. So when you have this going on, sooner or later, someone will realize we are really, really bad off. And there are two things that can be done about it. I had the dubious pleasure of doing one and much more honest pleasure of doing the other. One is, of course, retroactive. You already had your ritualistic development going for some time, and there's essentially a rotten code base which needs fixing. That can be, to a degree, remedied if you are allowed to. So what you can do is you can take your pointless Pact scripts, which are not really contract tests, and you can change them while pairing with everyone on the team. So that would be your cleanup. You will show what really is the point of this tool. Why are we doing those tests? Why are we writing this? Why do they need to sit, say, on the unit test level and not anywhere else? What is the cost of trying to push it higher? What is the problem with trying to test too much or too little? And as long as it does not break any of those higher policies, that should work. And again, in my recent placement, I did manage to fix at least the Pact side of things, essentially by a lot of explanation, by a lot of pairing, having sometimes mobbing session, which were just, let's take a few steps back, let's have a new look at this particular bit of Pact.js code and rewrite it to be an actual test, to actually work in a manner which is driven by the requirements for the consumer. Let's make sure that when we write the provider verification, all the provider states that we define are actually tied to consumer requirements. And that's one of the more perhaps tedious, but sometimes also quite satisfying bits of undoing the damage, because usually you will have an opportunity to learn a lot and teach a lot, because again, people who fall into ritualistic patterns of development do not do that deliberately. It's not like I decide, oh, I don't really care about programming. I just want to have it out of the way. If there is any possibility to do the engineering work right, pretty much anyone I ever met in development teams will jump on it. Like, yes, I want to write it the right way. I want to have the benefit. I want it to make sense. I want to understand this code so that when you move to another company, I still know why we write it this way. Sometimes it's not so easy, especially when you have the rot in the process side, because that's something much more embedded in the organizational structure, and that typically will not really yield. So if you wish to improve the situation in certain organization by any degree, you will probably focus on those not conflicting bits, which can be repaired without possibly running into any politics or policies or rules. While this actually more ineffective, I would say, side, the organizational, would be countered in the way I liked more, which is prevention. Or not even prevention, working in a way which does not even leave it any sort of a hole to get through. So one thing you can do is try to reduce your churn. Because as I mentioned a bit before, one of the reasons why people turn to rituals instead of always understanding what they do is because the expert is gone, because all of the experts are gone, and the code is still here and the rules are still here. So trying to reduce churn is one very, very simple thing. Obviously, sharing knowledge is very useful in those cases, and that can also be done as a cleanup part. But again, there seems to be a lot more bang for your buck if you do it before the rituals start to happen too much. The other thing, and that already ties my own approach to combating the code rot and process rot coming from ritual-driven development into agility. So essentially, agility is mostly a result of people working in fairly small companies, not really massive organizations delivering massive projects, more like smaller companies trying to keep up with rapidly changing market. And that means that a lot of those mechanisms that tend to lose their meaning and their understanding between people who exercise them, those practices come from small size of an autonomic team delivering some functionality, which obviously leads to flatten the structures. If there is an absolute need for a mid-manager to translate a vision of the seniors to something remotely understandable to people on the ground, probably agility is not the way to go. Probably if this is such a massive thing that it needs mid-managers to translate it and to keep an eye on everyone all the time, probably agility is not the way to go. And that's also how I got to reading those examples of how ritualistic approach can work in the larger companies, was by seeing what is the core of the problem, and the core being a massive organization trying to be very agile. And probably just recognizing what you are. Yes? Are you an almost startup, or are you Prudential Financial? And acting in a manner which is consistent with this core nature of your endeavor, of your organization, will be the way out. Because if you don't try to force agility into a massive team, which mostly needs to churn out a lot of code to pre-existing or pre-structured requirements, you don't really want the burden of agile ceremonies, which are mostly meant to allow you to quickly change your course. You are not changing your course. You actually want to stay your course and be very fast on it. On the other hand, if you do have a case for using agility, flatten the structures, probably with no mid-managers. And again, the perfect example of that I had the pleasure of working on was Fuse Universal, the team under the lead of Mr. Tim O'Donoghue, the CTO, who was the only person I responded to, and the only people that reported to me would be people on the ground, which means from your software engineer, from your tester to your CTO, there would only be one manager. And that meant everyone was very close to both sides of the process. That is, I would be steered directly by a C-level, and I would get my feedback directly from the people on the ground. If something seemed to take too much time, to not make a lot of sense, I would hear it immediately. So simple, very, very simple, if sometimes brutal operation of just flattening structures will do a lot to alleviate that. And as we all know, it has been tried before in different ways. If I recall correctly, GitHub has done it years before, but without really working on the very senior management's approach, and that did not work out so well. We will see what happens in Facebook, or well, in Meta. We are hearing some interesting signals from Mr. Zuckerberg. Again, that will be a very interesting thing to observe. Can they actually flatten the structure while being such a massive company? So yeah, essentially, yeah.
That's very very interesting. I was going to say that we do have about 8 minutes left to wrap up.
Yeah.
This is this the what we're showing over here? Is that an article that you wrote out there? Is that on the slide that we got out there?
Sorry?
Is that the slide we're looking at with the 166 is out? Is that an article that's on? It looks like it's.
So no, I did not have a link or a slide to illustrate flattening. Essentially, I would just go for flat structures at Meta.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
and that should give us some reference to how this bit is being done. Yep.
Yeah, I like what you're saying about being wary of rituals and what is already in place. I've actually currently on a project where we started out looking at Cucumber, and then I looked at I said, the framework in the Cucumber approach is a 4-layer approach. You've got your feature files, and you've got your glue code, your pages, your glue code, and then your base. And when I was working with the project, I said, maybe we don't have to go entirely with Cucumber. We could just do a straight up Selenium project, which has its advantages and disadvantages on that. I did want to ask.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So what you are looking at is perhaps Cucumber coming alone, without actual BDD, because to look at Cucumber and its massive cost and say, oh, I'm willing to take that cost, you need to have all the bits in place. That's really the biggest problem, I think, for anyone who dares to try BDD. Either really everyone is on board and you have your product owners very actively shaping the plain English part, and you have your test engineers who will spearhead the glue and the frameworks and the page objects if you do it in a UI-driven way, and developers who will, in the end, implement the features. So there's a massive lot of, let's say, team area that gets touched by BDD, and I would say it will only work if everyone understands what's happening. Yeah, and because if you are missing any of that, yes, the pure end-to-end Selenium suite will do a lot better for you.
Okay. Aaron is actually asking, what makes a ritual good or bad?
It's the point of it, because rituals mean that we repeat certain actions and don't really think a lot about them. And in some cases, actually, they are great. Like, say, you do your TDD. So you start by writing your test. This is actually a ritualistic behavior. And sometimes you might feel some rush to actually get to writing your feature code, but you stop yourself, you obey the ritual, and then you have your confidence coming from actually implementing the TDD approach. So this is a micro scale where even in strictly agile environment, this ritualistic obedience to writing your test first will give you immediate benefit. It starts being a problem when it continues without the real deep reason. Like there is the ritual, but there's no faith behind it.
I get that. One of the other things you mentioned early on was talking about velocity, and that is actually one thing that I was in on my current project where we are adding more people, and our velocity we were measuring is like basically how many test cases did we get automated each sprint, and we were doubling every single time. And I'm like, okay, one of the things I had to do was level set with my managers and say, this isn't going to keep doubling and doubling and doubling. We're not going to. They're going to plateau at some point, and I think the most important thing I learned out of that was giving a heads up to your management and say, okay, it's great that we're going up, but at some point we expect to level off, and then when you do, nobody's surprised that you didn't. Okay, you did 500 test cases last time. Why didn't you get to 1,000 this time?
This is the magic of numbers, isn't it? Yes, my number is growing. Things are good, which is obviously a trap. Yes, I need to understand what my number describes and what it really means.
Yeah. one of the other things I also point out to people, we've also seen that there's a meme out there where they have people talk about how do you get the rocks in the jar. I think it's like if you put the big rocks in first, then you can't get the pebbles and the small stuff in there. And I use that. I said automation is actually in inverse of that. Is the first things we're doing is the small pebbles are the easiest, smallest tasks, and they're easy to get done because they're very small. But at the end, when you get a couple of months into this, the only thing you got left are these huge test cases, these huge end-to-end things, and they'll take longer to accomplish. And that's another reason why we're plateauing on that. Is that kind
That
of like,
I suppose, I think it depends on your approach. Like, how do you run your automation project? Yeah, because if you're trying to be careful, if you want to start small and innocuous to keep going, you will have that. And again, this actually fits into this better part of my assignments earlier this year when taking something relatively small, relatively harmless first under work was the most successful because there was a benefit and there was really no risk to speak of. In terms of, let's say, fundamentally reshaping how your organization works efficiently, you might want to start big. This is what we have done in Fuse Universal. It was actually, I think, a massive gamble, which must have caused our CEO almost a heart attack. We actually said, yeah, like we are going for BDD. Like right now, we are hiring a product manager who is a great BDD fan. They hired me after I think a half a year of looking and like a whole day on-site interview. And they hired two excellent developer leaders, both backend and frontend. And that was a revolution. For I think 2 or 3 sprints, the metrics for tests were just dead. Like if you were going like a micromanaging judge looking at the numbers, you'd probably fire myself and everyone else very quickly. However, I think about 2 months in, our numbers started going up. We finally got a unit test suite for the front end, which was in React Native. And the best part was that about 5-6 months after this like really, really tumultuous moment of tackling big things first, we did have very clear cases of our product owners being able to immediately spot fake bugs in the reports. Yeah, as a company, we had a massive problem with a lot of bug reports which were dubious, which we did really a lot of work to even find out if we should do them. And at some point in one of the meetings, which were rituals between, let's say, the seniors and the product, on which were quite focused on bugs and problems that the users had with the app, the product owner started saying, "Sorry, this is not a bug. This was never required of us. Come on, let's get it on the roadmap." And so this is the kind of change you get if you actually do this big Las Vegas gamble.
This is great. This actually, I think this dovetails really nicely to our end here. Michael, I want to thank you very much for being a guest here at Zappletech on this session. Is there any last things, anything you want to share where anybody can get a hold of you or YouTube channels or anything like that?
So there should be probably somewhere on your list a link to my LinkedIn. Okay, and my LinkedIn in turn should lead to my GitHub pages.
Excellent.
Because actually, so far I haven't been very active in terms of sharing my knowledge with the broader audiences, which means I do not have a YouTube channel. I mostly have the GitHub pages and the LinkedIn.
That works fine. That's fine. Yeah. I have the same thing. I've got a Dark Arts Wizard GitHub account, and my job makes it so busy I almost never get to add anything to it. So with that, Michael, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it, and I'm gonna let you run. And again, thank you very much for the session.
Thank you very much for having me. I don't see any questions from the audience, which means that probably I went so deep on the management and that nobody had a question to ask.
Yep. There was one comment. David was saying he agrees. Well, I wasn't really the question. He was just saying, don't use Cucumber unless your team embraces BDD. I'm all for that. If you're embracing it, that's cool. And if not, that's straight up or take a look at alternatives. Always keep your mind open.
So, by the way, I didn't see it. You might want to keep an eye on that because it seems that the questions from the audience are appearing very late for us presenters. Because I see questions for Aaron. I see questions for Aaron, but I don't see the newest one.
Well, if there's other questions, we can get them over to you. We can answer them offline. Again, Michael, thank you very much for your time. I'm going to let everybody know we're going to wrap this up. We'll do it again next month. It's either going to be me or we'll have our other alternate guest out there hosting the meeting. I guess we're going to wrap this up here. Thank you very much for everybody for joining. We'll catch you next month. Take care and cheers.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.